My name is Leslie Lundeen. I'm the president of the Audiophile Foundation, and I'm pretty excited about the way we've set this up. I know if you've been on these other Zoom events, it's typically Jim interviewing or one of us interviewing a speaker. But we're starting to do different types of things now where we actually have David Gans doing the interviewing, or actually David Gans moderating, Brian Anderson interviewing John Curl. So it's slightly different than what we do for our other events, but I think it's a model that we want to start doing more in the future because effectively we want to have a series where we've got really knowledgeable interviewers and moderators for our speakers. And I think you all know John Curl. He's kind of one of us. He shows up on our Friday happy hours every week. So if you haven't been on the Friday happy hour and you want to have kind of a nice casual conversation with John, he's typically there every Friday. David Gans has, I think this is your third event with us. And it's kind of funny because I've been wanting to do more formal interviews with John, and David has done 2 events with John, but neither of them were recorded to our satisfaction. So I reached out to David and said, well, we need to do this yet another time, but we're going to do a Zoom recording so we can save it for posterity. And David said, well, I know I've done it multiple times, but I was just reading Brian's book, and I think we should have Brian do it. And he'll be involved. So this is how this evolved. I'm super excited about it. David is going to do what I normally do, which is to say, everybody mute. and he's going to read the chats as they come in. But I think you're really going to enjoy it. And David, I will give it to you.
All right. Well, I have gotten some practice. I'm trying to find the chat here so I can follow it. There we go. I have been teaching a class for Stanford online, so I've suddenly gotten good at handling large crowds of people on Zoom. But if you all mute yourselves, we won't have any problems tonight. Leslie kind of told the story of how this happened. I was very happy to sign up to interview John Curl again because it's always fascinating, but I had just finished reading in manuscript form Brian Anderson's new book, Loud and Clear. And I thought, well, I've talked to John twice before, but this guy is right on top of this. He just wrote a wonderful, wonderful book about this very topic. So let's get him in here to do it. It'll be good promotion for the book. It'll be a much better interview from John's standpoint, I'm sure. So there's really not much more for me to add. So I'm basically going to introduce these guys and then sit back and just make sure that everybody behaves. Oh, and I'll be looking at the questions or comments in the chat, and we'll stop once or twice maybe during the course of the thing and ask if anybody has any questions. We'd love it if you would remain muted unless and until you are going to speak publicly to the group. So, John Curl is a distinguished electronics engineer and audio designer known for his innovative contributions to high-end audio equipment. His career began at Ampex, where he played a pivotal role in designing tape recorders. Later, he ventured into the rock music scene, creating sound systems for iconic bands like the Grateful Dead and Jefferson Airplane. Curl's expertise in audio engineering led him to collaborate with Mark Levinson, resulting in the groundbreaking JC2 stereo preamplifier in 1974, which set new standards in the industry for sound quality and performance. In 1989, Curl joined Parasound, where he has since designed a range of high-power amplifiers and consulted on various components. Brian Anderson is a Webby Award-winning senior features editor, writer, and producer during his time at Vice magazine. More recently, Anderson did a stint running the science desk at The Atlantic, where he was part of the Pulitzer Prize-winning team for early pandemic coverage and was later a senior editor at Vox. His 2015 Vice feature on the Wall of Sound served as the jumping-off point for his first book, Loud and Clear, The Grateful Dead's Wall of Sound and the Quest for Audio Perfection, available June 17th from St. Martin's Press. He lives and works in Chicago, where he teaches journalism at Northwestern University, and a piece of the Wall of Sound sits in his living room. So before I turn it over to Brian, I want to just say that I had the great privilege of seeing the Grateful Dead play in front of the Wall of Sound, I think 8 times, and I was at several of the proto Wall of Sound events. I was there at Stanford February 9th, 1973, the night they blew out all the tweeters. I was at Winterland in November of '73 and got to see 2 of the near Wall of Sound shows. I saw 2 of the 4, or 2 of the 3 almost Wall of Sound shows at Winterland in February of '74. And then I got to be at the Cow Palace in for March 23rd, 1974, the official debut of the official Wall of Sound. You, sir, are nowhere near old enough to have had any such experiences. How did you wind up on this particular bit of history?
Excellent question. I mean, first of all, thank you, Leslie and Jim, for putting this together. Huge honor to be here. Also, big shout out to David, someone who I sort of grew up listening to on the radio. Thanks for moderating tonight's discussion and asking me to participate. This really means a lot. So I think there's sort of 3 answers to that question. I sort of really got going on this book journey in early 2023, right after I got the book deal. That's sort of the moment that I kind of had to crack my knuckles and start writing this thing. But the second answer to that is 2015 is when I wrote that first story for Vice when I was an editor there. And that dropped the weekend of the Fare Thee Well show here in Chicago. Just totally by coincidence, it happened to come out that weekend. And it got a lot of attention. That felt really, really nice. It was I think a 9,000 word web story. And at the time, I remember thinking, wow, I really went in deep on this. Surely this is like the definitive story about the Wall of Sound. But mere days, weeks later, I realized that I had just kind of barely scratched the surface. And there's so much more here. I think I can maybe write a book about this one day. So I sort of filed the idea away. But the real answer as to how I got going on this journey is, I was raised by 2 deadhead parents who I think might be watching this right now, who, sort of saw the band in the late 60s and in the early 70s in the Midwest region. A very crucial proving ground, the Midwest, to the Dead's audio project. But my dad was seeing shows at the Kinetic Playground, the Syndrome. Both my parents were at the Auditorium Theater, the International Amphitheater. So seeing the band 71, 72, 73, it was as it was kind of building up. And then in 74, in Des Moines at the fairgrounds, back here at the International Amphitheater. So, I grew up with this music around me, and sort of grew up listening to my parents talk about seeing the band back in the day, and they had this mountain of speakers behind them. It was called the Wall of Sound. And so it has just captivated me sort of my entire life. So I really feel like this is, it's kind of been, I'm going on 39 years old. Did not see the Dead when the Wall of Sound was a thing. But yeah, I feel like I've kind of been working up to this in a strange way, kind of my whole life. Did see the Dead in the late 80s when my dad was doing some work with the Dead's Midwest local crew, doing some stagehand work. So, my folks would take my sister and I up to Alpine Valley up in Wisconsin to see the Dead up there. So some of my very earliest flashes of memory are, watching the Dead perform and being sort of freaked out during, space sections. But very, very formative memories, seeing the Dead just at a young age. So that's sort of how all of this came together. And somewhere along the way, I think I got John's email or his phone number. I can't totally remember. Um, but we got to talking, and I knew that if I wanted to do this story right, it's a huge story, um, and doing it right would be a matter of talking to everyone who was in the room, working with the band behind the scenes, developing this amazing rig over a number of years. So there's a whole cast of characters in the book, and John is one of them. Um, so I was actually sort of thinking, maybe I could read sort of a brief excerpt
Yeah.
from the first chapter of the book, and that can kind of like paint some of the broad strokes. Then we can kind of get into, asking some questions of John here.
Please do.
So here it is. Once again, loud and clear. It comes out June 17th on St. Martin's Press. So yes, this is from chapter 1 here. And just to sort of give you some context, this excerpt sort of centers around so the speaker cabinet that's directly behind me right here. This was part of the Wall of Sound, and I won it at a Sotheby's auction a couple years ago. So I sort of use this artifact here as sort of a window into telling a much bigger story. Um, so here we go. The artifact is a one-of-a-kind hunk of junk with a patina of scuffs, dings, worn edges, adhesive residue, and frayed wiring. It measures 31 by 22.5 by 24 inches and is constructed of 14 ply laminated Finnish birchwood painted matte black. That one of its two 12-inch cones is missing lends the cabinet a winking robot resemblance. Don't even get me started on its dank interior odor. The monitor now sits silently in my office, and everyone in my family has had a moment with it. I won it at auction, the piece with the lowest starting price among a Sotheby's sale of decommissioned items from the Grateful Dead's Northern California warehouse. But it's invaluable to me, and I'll come to suspect that the appraiser didn't entirely know what they had. The handwritten G period dead and the date, that would be July 17th, 1974, stamped on the back of the 12-inch cone, suggests that this 64-pound unit was not merely, quote, used on stage at some point in the band's 3-decade history for the Sotheby's listing. The artifact was likely one of the vocal fill speakers, that's F-I-L-L, not Phil Lesh, fill speakers used in the monumental concert sound system that the Dead built and toured with in the early 1970s. Despite its short life, the Wall of Sound, as this singular public address or PA rig is known, revolutionized the modern entertainment industry and encapsulates a pivotal yet unexplored piece of musical, technological, and cultural history. Not only did my artifact here clock thousands of miles in these years, hauled into and out of dozens of cities and venues in the US, Canada, and Europe, but the sound waves that flowed out of it also touched hundreds of thousands of people, participated in the live experience of the Dead in a peak era, my parents included. More than Deadhead lore or an audiophile fever dream, the story of the Wall of Sound is one of convention-breaking obsession and titanic human achievement, featuring a group of individuals who risked their lives in the tireless quest for good sound. The Dead developed an unprecedented high-fidelity PA consisting of hundreds of speakers and dozens of power amplifiers stacked in columns behind the band. not to be confused with the late hitmaker and convicted murderer Phil Spector's music production formula. The Dead's wall of sound was physically gargantuan. Its assembled hardware weighed as much as a dozen full-grown elephants, stood as tall as a school bus is long, and stretched the length of a regulation basketball court. The Wall of Sound was a manifestation of the 1970s age of extremes and experimentation. The system was a launch pad for the future of music and performance, and massively influential because it gave each individual player an unmatched command over their own onstage mix. From a musician standpoint, the late Phil Lesh, the Dead's bassist, wrote in his memoir, Searching for the Sound, the most endearing aspect of this system was the control the band now had over the actual sound heard by the audience. The band's sound crew had eliminated the necessity for a front-of-house mixer, returning the responsibility to the musicians, where it belongs, Lesh said. The sound man's job was now to monitor the sound in the hall and to report back if any adjustments were necessary, Lesh said. For instance, more vocals or drums or less piano. The idea was radically simple. Whereas conventional setups placed monitor speakers, which allow performers to hear themselves playing, in front of musicians, the Dead placed their monitors, like my artifact, behind the band, so they heard exactly what the audience heard. The point of the Wall of Sound, moreover, was to eliminate monitors. So it's not only that the monitors were behind the musicians, the PA was their monitors. The Dead's rig was a technological feat, but also a strenuous financial and human undertaking, requiring a crew of over 24 roadies and sound techs and a fleet of semi-trucks to transport. The Wall eventually forced the band to go on hiatus, nearly a decade into their career. Tracking the rise, fall, and afterlife of this remarkable sound system and the ambitions, machinations, and dramas that played out behind it is a story about an inspired group effort. The relationships forged between towering figures in modern musical history and the eccentric and unsung characters around them, and what happened when rampant drug use poisoned the project. The Dead are a uniquely American institution that remains equally beloved, misunderstood, maligned, and undeniable. How and why the Dead matter more than ever to millions of people of all ages around the world are touch points, even for those who may not call themselves deadheads, but who are interested in thinking about hearing and consuming music today. These are practices that are still defined by the Dead's enduring influence on generations of musicians and consumers and their relationship to tech, performance, and fandom. Meanwhile, surviving Wall of Sound personnel are in their 70s and 80s. Many have lived hard years and are now experiencing health issues, from knee replacements to strokes to terminal illnesses, to say nothing of hazy memories. Dead and Company, the hugely popular revival project featuring longtime Dead members, Bob Weir on guitar, Bill Kreutzmann and Mickey Hart on drums, plus a new guitarist, John Mayer, announced their touring retirement after a final stadium run in 2023, renewing interest in and appreciation for this era-defining band and their outrageous sound system. Then, in 2024, Dead and Company announced a 30-night Las Vegas residency at the Sphere, the $2.3 billion state-of-the-art venue with a spatial audio system that may be quantum leaps beyond the Wall, but is a direct descendant of it. After the success of that run, Dead and Company announced another 18-show residency for spring of 2025. The Wall of Sound might have fallen silent a half-century ago, but the system's reverberations only grow louder. So that's a little taste from the first chapter of of Loud and Clear. And before we get into some questions with John, just real quick, after that, I do need to make an admission. This is not a technical tome. I am at best sort of a wannabe audiophile, and I wrote this book for a general audience. To be sure, the book does get deep into a good deal of the real nitty-gritty of the Dead's early 70s thinking around implementing linear arrays with their towering speaker stacks in the wall of sound, for instance, and eliminating intermodulation distortion by having no two sounds go through any one particular speaker, and their decision making around what type of wood to use for constructing speaker boxes that made up the wall of sound, and so forth. And also, the acoustic theory that sort of undergirds these kinds of principles and practices. The book gets into all of that. But at the same time, this is not a gear book per se. What this is a people book. It's a story that's populated by individuals like John Curl here. And it gets at what made them tick and what was driving them both individually and as a collective in the late 60s and the early to mid 70s in pursuit of good sound, right? So, in other words, I'm not so much interested solely on the very dense, heady, at times kind of dry theory and the attending equipment and the hardware, as I am in the human beings who, in this case, were behind the scenes in the room working alongside the band in designing and scaling up this amazing rig that we now know as the Wall of Sound.
And I'm hoping John can report some of the actual conversations they had with the musicians.
Absolutely, yes. So the book is interested and my spiel is almost done here. Then I'm going to ask John some questions. The book is interested in what their humanity sort of brought to bear on the gear and on actualizing what were then very kind of radical, never before attempted approaches to live sound presentation that in many ways sort of set the blueprint for how we experience live music to this day. So this is a story animated by a whole cast of characters. One of them is John here. I had the pleasure of speaking with you, John, a couple times during my reporting of this story. And all y'all who are watching and listening this evening can read more about that in the book. But for the purposes of our talk here, I'm wondering if, just sort of to set the scene here, you could talk just a little bit, John, about what you were up to in the audio space kind of just before your entry into Dead World. And when was that?
I had a friend at Ampex, and he was actually in the video department of all things, and I was in the audio department. Well, it just so happened that was Ron Wickersham at the time, before he went to work for the Dead. And so Ron and I became good friends, partly because I was open-minded to his being a hippie and looking like one, even though he was working in a technical environment, the old IBM problem, suits and so forth. Well, we all wore, I wore a jacket and a tie, but Ron did not. And anyway, we remained friends. And then Ron left Ampex and went to work for the Dead. And so I wound up quitting Ampex, partly over salary. And I wanted a raise and they wouldn't give me one. I said, screw it, I'm going to go back to audio, which I had an offer to work in a hi-fi store.
John, can you tell us when this was, what year this was taken?
This is 1969.
Thank you.
And I had just left Ampex, and I got this job basically with the same wage, working in a hi-fi store in Berkeley. It was an advanced place for the time. We sold Klipsch and Macintosh and all that, I mean, but the boss was an engineer, an audio engineer himself. So he was very special when it came to people working in hi-fi stores. He was for me, he was much more interesting. But as time went on, I realized that I needed to get back to engineering, and there just wasn't enough engineering in the job of working in a hi-fi store. There was some engineering, but most of it was sales and repair, of course. And I said, "Oh man, I've got to go back to the to the world, of engineering." And at one point where I was wondering what I was going to do with myself, Ron, contacted me and said, "John, why don't you work for us?" I said, "You mean the Grateful Dead?" You know me, man. I mean, I'm a suit and jacket and a tie kind of guy, well, yeah, why not? And so I got into it, and I started working for the Grateful Dead, or Alembic, actually, not the Grateful Dead themselves. In fact, they were on the road when I was actually first hired in. And so Ron and I, he was technical, and he could, he and I could talk in almost like a separate language. I remember some young lady walking past us and saying, listening to us talking, and she says, "It is a different language," It's like, and I guess so. But we were, quite serious about making the best that we possibly could. And so that's how I started with the Grateful Dead. It was actually in the it was in the spring, or late spring, maybe. I can't remember the date exactly. It was after March 15th, but that's all I know. That was as a time, tag. And I started working with them, and I worked with them for, about a year. And then I was actually let go. So
What did you do?
when I left?
What did you, in that year, what did you do for them?
Oh, what I do in the year? Oh, that's, yeah. Well, first of all, of course, I had to work with the sound system. And I had to learn the sound system like everybody else, because we did recording as well, 16-channel recording as well, and when we wanted to, with the sound system. We actually had a splitter. We split all the mics so that we could actually run a separate feed to the tape recorder. And then we could, theoretically, 16-channel master any show if we really wanted to. And we did sometimes.
Yeah.
And the Live Dead album came from that. That was before my time, but it's still a great album. It's my favorite.
Yeah.
And it came from that time where we just used a 16-channel recorder right off the mics of the stage.
Yeah.
And this was way before the wall of sound. The sound system at the time, to some degree, looked the same, except in miniature, as the wall of sound.
Yeah.
It used the same basic cabinets that you see, but not as many, not 1/3 as many.
Yeah.
And they were stacked on top of each other a little bit, but they were not really stacked super high or anything.
Yeah.
And that was how it was.
Right. Yeah, John, you're already leading right into, my sort of next question here.
Yeah.
Which is, as far as the state of the Dead sound system in the earliest days of the band, when you were kind of first coming on the scene, can you just speak briefly to, the kinds of materials and the sound quality that were standard, kind of in general at the time? And the next part of that question, what was it about the Dead that sort of made them fixated on a cleaner, more clarifying sound?
Well, I think that actually it was Osley, or Bear, as we call him. He had set the scene early, before my time. He had found a mixer that you need a mix to, mix the show kind of thing, for the voices and all. And he found these Ampex mixers. Now, I'd worked at Ampex, but I worked at Ampex when it was all solid state. There wasn't a single tube to be found when I worked there. But back in the day, back in the 50s and so forth, they made a mixer out of vacuum tubes, and it sounded pretty darn good. And so they had this solid state mixer. I mean, not solid state. They had this vacuum tube mixer. And then they had vacuum tube power amps. They found these Macintosh 350 watt per channel. I mean, they're big things. Made kind of for the military, you know what I mean? This is not a home unit usually. And 350 watts a channel, and they were just a single channel at the time. And they weighed well over 100 pounds. And the sound overall was pretty darn good for small places, where you only had a few hundred people, like a club or a small ballroom. It worked out just fine. We didn't need any more than that.
Yeah.
And that's where it all started. And my job in life was to actually replace the vacuum tubes, the mixer at first, with solid state. And I made a serious attempt, Ron Wickersham and I both made a serious attempt to make a solid state replacement for the Ampex mixers. And we did everything that we thought was by the book. And guess what? It didn't work very well. It measured okay, but it didn't sound right. And that was found by the band when it was accidentally ruined by Osley. He had tried to put he thought he would try to improve the sound of the mixer, then took it off the AC line and put it on batteries. The only thing is, he put the batteries in backwards.
Oh, no.
And it blew everything up. So they had to go back, which they had as a backup, the vacuum tubes. And when they went back to the vacuum tubes, they said, "Oh, we don't want that. We don't want that solid state mixer anymore." And actually, in a way, that was part of why I was probably given my notice. You know what I mean? I had not been the guy who, even if I was capable of many things, I was not capable of making the band super happy with the sound quality.
Mm-hmm.
This was tough. So I had to move on, and I did.
Yeah.
And I moved on to making a rock film myself. So I had employment. In fact, the Grateful Dead were in that rock film, and I was able to see them again and say hello. And I used their equipment. We actually used their master recorder.
What film was that?
The last days of the Fillmore.
Ah, you worked on that film? Cool.
Yeah, I really did work on it. In fact, they gave me a big, a primary, title kind of thing later.
I would like to know if you understand in retrospect why the solid state mixer didn't sound as good as the tube mixer.
Well, two things. I thought at first, and I was partially right, that it was the integrated circuits that I had chosen, which were the best of its kind. They were made for the military. They weren't made for the regular, cheap commercial audience. They were very expensive things in their best form. But the real problem, I realized later, because we didn't know any better, was the ceramic capacitors that we used that were used as coupling capacitors, because we were trying to make the thing fairly small, because you remember the integrated circuits are pretty small. So the coupling capacitors can be just huge compared to if you're not careful. So these capacitors, Ron had found these capacitors, and they were ugly little guys, but we said, well, they seem to do all right. And we couldn't see anything obvious wrong with them. And we wired the whole thing together. But a year or so later, in fact, I was left dead by then, we realized about what was wrong with the capacitors. And I learned from a company called Tektronix up in Oregon. I'd gone to visit them, and they had a tester, and they were showing these capacitors, and they showed the problems, and I mean big problems. But yet my normal test equipment couldn't measure it easily. So it was like, but the problems were real and humongous, really embarrassingly bad. So
Excuse me, did it have to do with the quality of the capacitor in general, or did it have to do with consistency? John Meyer told me once that one of the big issues he faced when he started getting into this business was that JBL speakers came off the line and no two of them were alike. And the repeatability and standardization and consistency were really lacking in those days.
It was the material.
Oh, okay.
As capacitors are fairly big things. In the original form, in the crudest, let's say more primitive form, they're small. They can be size of Coke cans or small barrels. I mean, they're not small for a given amount of capacitance, which is necessary with solid state. Solid state requires large value capacitors for coupling between stages. That's not true with vacuum tubes. Vacuum tubes, you can use small capacitors because the impedances working resistances of a vacuum tube system is maybe 100 or even 1,000 times higher. So the coupling capacitor could be 1,000 times smaller. Well, gee, you think about that. You can use a much better cap, even though it still has some finite size. The tube is fairly big anyway. So it doesn't, but when you have a little integrated circuit and you don't have, and then you have this huge capacitor next to it, it's unwieldy. It makes the case much bigger and so forth. So, and it doesn't look quite right aesthetically.
Yeah.
So what we've done, by the way, is we've gotten rid of all the capacitors now. In other words, all my latest work, which I didn't do that with the Dead, but my latest work, I mean, we just don't use capacitors in the same way anymore. We just don't have them in the circuit.
Yeah. So John, just sort of like stick to the chronology here. You sort of broke off from the Dead, but in the early 70s, you still had a relationship with Alembic, correct? So you were
I slept over at Ron Wickersham's house.
Right. So you were still orbiting the Dead project because Alembic was so tight at that point. I think there is like a lingering and widespread misconception that the Wall of Sound sort of fell from the clear blue sky, fully formed on March 23rd, 1974 at the Cow Palace in Daly.
Oh, no, it was an hour. It was almost 9 months earlier, let's say.
Right.
I just gotten back from Europe. In fact, I remember this. And then I contacted Ron because I'd been in Europe for 3 months or so.
Yeah.
And and Ron said, "Hey, we're doing a thing here. We're going to make a project. You want to work for the Dead directly?" Because I wasn't working for the Dead directly. Right. I worked for Alembic.
Right.
See, and when I got laid off and all, I was with Alembic and not with the Dead. The Dead actually kind of served the Grateful Dead. But this time it was the Grateful Dead who were writing the paychecks.
Right.
And so they gave me an offer I couldn't easily refuse. And Ron gave me a working space in San Francisco in his in their the Alembic recording studio, right. and an office, and on Brady Street. And then I spent a fairly comfortable year working on the Wall of Sound,
Right.
and it was more than a year. It was, it was more than a year.
Right. Yeah, and I sort of I mentioned that misconception, right? Uh, because in the book I go to great lengths to sort of illuminate the reality that the Wall of Sound was sort of the apex of really a years long progression. It was an ongoing project that began really like in the band's earliest days.
Well, maybe it did, and I didn't even know that for sure. I do know that Osley wanted to do this Wall of Sound, and I knew that he was the guy who was crazy enough to recommend it or demand it. You might say he was quite a character. He was one of those B.T. Barnum types.
Right.
He really could sell an idea.
Did he know his stuff?
Huh?
Did he
The
know
parallel stuff? Oh yeah, he was very well rounded in many ways. He wasn't good, he was a jack of all trades. And he wasn't
Yeah.
necessarily, well, he was good at many things, but not necessarily. He wasn't an electronics engineer.
Right. I mean,
That's why I needed people like me.
right. Yeah. From my understanding, just reporting out this whole book, Owsley was brilliant and was was
He was like
the
Steve Jobs kind of guy.
yeah, he was the force of ideas, but he needed people like you, John, and others to sort of actualize
Absolutely, yes.
those ideas.
Yeah, we had to make, how we would do it would be like, we'd say, oh no, you want what? And then a week later, say, well, it's possible maybe, if we do. And then, yeah, okay, let's do it,
Right.
It was always like that.
Right. Yeah. And I mentioned this kind of the wall being this ongoing project that kind of peaked in 1974, right? Because I think it really kind of kicked into high gear in, late 71 and then through 72 and 73, especially. I think those years are when like the real the real work happened as far as actualizing, what Owsley called the big system, which
Well,
he
it kept getting bigger. Let's
kept
just say
getting bigger.
that.
Yeah.
And it was not just the sound system for the vocals, which was probably the really biggest thing about the Wall of Sound, in the differential mics. But the thing is, with the instruments, they kept building the stacks behind for the bass and the Jerry and everyone. They kept building it taller and bigger and
Yeah.
actually mostly vertically. Because you only have so much space on the stage.
Can you explain the principle of the line array, that's standing close to the line array and hearing the same thing coming out of it that the people in the back are hearing and nobody's ears are being blown out?
Well, in theory, and this was Ron Wickersham told me this a long time ago. See, Ron Wickersham may have been one of the first people to really push that vertical array. Now, vertical arrays have been around. I mean, it isn't like they didn't exist. I mean, you can find them in textbooks from the 50s and so forth. But the thing about it is the Ron came from FM radio and radio. In other words, he worked in radio stations, and he was an engineer who knew antenna theory. And in antenna theory, you can take a radio station and point the energy that you want to whoever you want to serve. You don't always have to have it radiate in all directions. You can have it aim, for example, down in Baja California, they had a place called XERB.
Oh, yeah.
And Wolfman Jack was on there, and it would aim only north. I mean, why would they want anything else? It's all in English, So it's like, but they put, well, I don't know what it was, big, very high power unit, and you could get it up in San Francisco without any trouble, even though it was in Baja California. And so that basic antenna theory says that if it works acoustically too, that if you stack a vertical dipole, in other words, you're creating like a long, thin loudspeaker. You're actually creating it may not be 12 inches wide, but it's 36 feet high. See what I mean? I mean, it's 1 foot high, 1 foot wide, let's say 36 to 1 or something. Well, what you do is you make a long, skinny kind of thing, and it doesn't come out with what we call, it doesn't radiate in all directions equally. It actually tends to not radiate down or up, but only out and about, sideways. So what that does is it creates a different kind of waveform. It theoretically, instead of being an exponential wave where it's expanding exponentially and getting weaker because it drops the square, it actually drops only linearly because the waveform itself is a cylinder, like rather than a spherical.
Wow.
And then what happens is that you don't get to bounce off the ceiling, which is good because many of these halls are pretty bad that way, and you don't even get anything off the floor either. So you tend to go over in many ways over the audience a little bit that are the closest to you, because you don't really want them to be too exposed to the sound, because they try to get too close, and it might hurt them. So it tends to, a lot of it beams over their heads.
But the musician's standing in front of his speaker array, and it's loud enough to hit the third deck of a stadium, but it's not tearing the top of his head off. How does that work?
Well, I don't know. I can't really say. The biggest thing that we got rid of were the higher order, high harmonic distortion of the horn throats that were used initially with the Dead from the early years. See, in the most high frequency things above, let's say 1,000 cycles, had to be dealt with some sort of horn loaded system. It was done by Voice of the Theater, Altec Lansing. It was done by JBL. It was done by everybody, for movie theaters primarily in the beginning. And the thing is that it never worked very well for really loud presentations. It just the speaker could make a lot of noise, but a lot of it was 30% distortion. You know what I mean? And you just got so much distortion that you were it bothered your ear, because it kicked all the really musical stuff, the stuff that was being sung or whatever, up 3 times, to third, fifth, or second, all this. It was doubling and tripling the waveform frequency to where your ears are the most sensitive. And that was not so good. So it tends to burn your ears, kind of annoying. It becomes annoying. And that's one of the things that the sound system didn't do very much of, is annoy you. It could be very loud and not burn your ears.
Right.
At least you thought so at the time.
Yeah. And I think, it's important to mention here that the wall comprised, 6 independent systems, right? It was an 11-channel PA.
You're right.
Right.
It was actually a mono PA.
The mono PA, yeah.
It was a mono voice PA.
Right.
One voice. Remember,
right.
Osley he didn't like stereo.
Right.
And that center cluster was mono, guys. It wasn't stereo. It's no ping pong back and forth. But there was some ping ponging kind of could be made, because each individual instrument being amplified had its own place along the array. So you could actually get things to go back and forth if you really wanted to, but they would be between instruments. And that kept the intermodulation down. That's where the intermodulation comes from.
Right.
Intermodulation only comes when you mix too many frequencies together, and they distort within the amplifiers or the speakers, and then they create even more frequencies, and they're not just up like the horn throat distortion, they're down too. They're everywhere. They muddy the sound. And that's what apparently Osley knew this, of course, and that's one of the reasons this thing had a like you said, 11-channel system. I never really thought about how many channels it really was at the time. What I was doing,
Right. So, you had a space to work out of the Alembic office or the Alembic workshop, right? And at the same time, Alembic was starting to build its own sort of like PA for rent, essentially. The Alembic PA is what it's now known as. The debt eventually bought that system.
Well,
from
it was rather confusing. See, it was Osley who actually owned everything at first.
Yeah.
He's the one that started Alembic.
Right.
He alone, but he didn't stay with Alembic. He was in jail for a while, and he was he didn't really show up on a regular basis. He was more a guy who liked to come in and tell us what he wanted us to do, and then he left. You know what I mean? And Alembic actually had to create their own company.
Yeah,
they did that with Wickersham and Matthews and that other fellow.
Rick Turner.
Rick. Those three incorporated,
Right.
and they were the ones that did that. And and Bear wasn't even there. I mean, he wasn't in part of that. He at the time, of course, he was in jail, I think, at the time that they actually did that. So,
Yeah.
but what can I say? Bear had a lot of ideas, and he would try them out. He was quite a phenomenon, really, in a way.
Yeah. There's a scene in the book. Rick Turner, speaking of, who you just mentioned, Alembic co-founder. Rick, played a crucial role, sort of doing the mathematics to come up with the dimensions of a lot of these speaker boxes.
It's actually in the book.
It's in the book. Yeah.
Book, the book that we basically copied. John Meyer gave us the book.
Yeah.
He actually got it from my old boss and his and my old boss.
Right. And you're talking about Harry Olson's acoustic.
Yes, right. Yeah. In other words, my old boss had an original copy, and then he loaned it to John Meyer. And then John Meyer, said, hey, we could make some, and then he talked to Bear about it, I think. And we decided to make copies. We actually had it Xeroxed because it was out of print.
Right.
I mean, here we are working with stuff that's out of print. Well, that's kind of crazy. But it was, because
what is the title and author of this book?
Oh, Harry Olson.
Harry Olson, Acoustic Engineering.
That's one
of a Bible for all of this stuff then.
Yeah. And it was all there. There were other authors who were roughly equal. It was both Beranek and Newman. That guy Beranek wrote a book too, and it was a similar book, had other things that were equally important. We took what we could from the actual people who actually were mathematically oriented and advanced to write a book. It wasn't just a how-to book. It was here's why the theory is what it is. This is what you do. Everything is a trade-off. Everything you do, even if it's home hi-fi or whatever, it's always a trade-off. You can't get everything for free.
Yeah.
Or for nothing.
It looks like someone is asking a question in the chat about what sort of tweeter was used in the wall, and that's sort of feeding into another question I wanted to ask you about, which is, what can you sort of tell us about the development of the center cluster, which is kind of, kind of like the defining element.
These kind of loudspeaker arrays were becoming available. Not just, yeah, they basically kind of a little bit of Bose. If you really look at a Bose speaker, from the back, you see this cluster of like 9 5-inch speakers or 4-inch speakers, you see. But we didn't want to use that quality of speaker. We wanted to use the best speaker we could get.
Yeah.
And it just so happened that JBL made a speaker that wasn't really made for PA at all. Not really. It was made for airport PA, like that thing, the flight number 12, kind of thing out of the ceiling, right?
Yeah.
And these are ceiling speakers. And they were just little guys, and they were very efficient. And the beauty of these speakers, and this is something very important to us, we could repair them ourselves. In other words, they had a little rebuild kit that you could buy from JBL, because these are JBLs. And you could buy this rebuild kit. And then if you burned out the core, cone or something, or it got damaged, you just replaced it. And, and you kept the frame and all the heavy duty stuff, and the magnets, you kept that, you didn't have to rebuy that.
Right.
And that was very important, because the guys talked about in your what I saw in your book was, they said that the Frisbees and things, people throw Frisbees around, and they would hit the cluster, and they could knock a speaker out, and so it was very important for us to be able to repair, not necessarily, we wouldn't repair the device itself at that moment, but we would actually replace it. But then when we took it home, you see, back to the office, we could repair it and then put it back together, back as good as new.
Right.
And the tweeter that we used that was mostly from me. That was Electro Voice tweeter, and it just happened to be a better tweeter. We tried all the JBL tweeters, and then we tried this Electro Voice, and it was smoother and lower distortion than the others, the JBL ones. All the JBL ones had problems. Some of them had good frequency response, but high distortion. Some of them, one of them had low distortion, but it had a glitch around 10,000 cycles. It was perfectly circular. You probably have seen it. It's a kind of a dome, a metal dome. And I call it a ring resonator instead of a ring radiator, because that's what it did. It sat there and resonated at 10,000 cycles, and you could hear it, it's peculiar, like, what is that, So we decided not to use that, even though we'd used them by the dozens and dozens in home systems. We decided that the Electro Voice was better. Now, they didn't cost that much, and they used a whole array of them. And apparently they blew out. I don't remember this, but they blew out the tweeter array the first day out or something in 73 or something. And the beauty of those speakers too was they were repairable.
Right.
You could just buy the little kit, you see. And the guys, the roadies and all, especially, Kid and Sparky, and they would learn how to do that. They'd be quite good at that.
Yeah.
Repairing. And even the big speakers could be repaired.
Yeah.
The 12s and the 15s.
Right. Yeah. Quite a few of the roadies I spoke with all talked about going to reconing school and learning how to repair.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, these things are expensive devices, because they have big magnet systems and big frames, They're built like built like a tank, and they're not built for like home use as much. And they cost there's an initial cost that's more.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. A lot of this stuff was, military spec almost.
Well, in a way, yeah. Well, let's say commercial spec. You know what I mean?
Commercial spec.
Yeah. for let's say Las Vegas or something.
Yeah, right. So let's talk about another sort of defining piece of the wall of sound, which were the phase canceling microphones, right?
Okay.
These sort of deals. Um, can you talk about your role, um, the role that you played, sort of just helping to design um, that piece of the wall of sound, which I think was as much to uh, eliminate feedback as it was to sort of limit leakage, right?
We started out with the basic idea, which I didn't know would work at all. But then we got a pair of mics that we were basically not the fanciest, but they're Omni mics. They're not directional, these mics, and they are put side by side or one on top of the other, either way. And in any case, they one is wired in out of phase with the other one. So what happens is they cancel each other if you talk it directly between the two mics. And it's easy to do. You don't have any sound at all, because the same sound that goes into one mic its opposite goes into the other mic, and it just basically doesn't have anything. And the better, of course, the matching of the mics, the better you can have the cancellation. And that's where maybe the leakage comes in. Yeah. But we went all the way. Bear had a Nagra, and the Nagra people actually had a microphone preamp that was a little bit less expensive than the Buell & Care, but they used the Buell & Care element, and the Buell & Care elements were very expensive. They were hundreds and hundreds of dollars each. Mm-hmm. And they were made for precision and a high level. You couldn't overload them. They do 140 SPL into them. They were made for like testing jet engines and things as well as anything else. But guess what? They had a flat response to 40,000 cycles. So boy, oh boy, these things were really good. Most microphones couldn't do 20. And these guys really kicked, and but that when we got them, they were so matched that they really did cancel each other out.
Yeah.
They didn't sound very good, though. The vocals did not sound good coming through those mics. I saw that system 8 times or so, and the differential mics did not have good quality output.
Well, they don't have that bass reinforcement of the voice.
No proximity effect.
They're just the opposite.
Ah, that's it. So we were just used to proximity effect and all the dynamic mics.
In a way, yeah.
Okay, that makes sense.
And it's also that they actually have the opposite of the proximity effect. They'll take a certain part of the voice, probably the lower part, and throw it away because of the way we radiate from our mouths or something.
So the chest cancels.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. And we lose it. It's not so good.
Yeah.
But I've heard that one before, and yeah. And you know what? Interestingly enough, we have actually used those. John Mayer did it, especially. We used those microphones. We still have them. I mean, we used them for recording symphony orchestras, and they really do well there. So it's not like there's anything really non-fidelity about those microphones, but they weren't sweet sounding. If you wanted sugar, they were not. They were very revealing and maybe a little metallic.
Yeah, you had to know how to use them too. And I think there's a couple funny moments. I talk about one of them in the book. May 26, 1973, Kezar Stadium in San Francisco. Waylon Jennings opened.
Oh, that was so funny. I mean,
the Dead, and Waylon,
that was the one that described it to you.
right? Yeah,
It is sad, you know. I mean, Waylon was doing his harmonica thing, I think, and he was bouncing back and forth, you know, and between the two mics, and he was going in and out. I mean, he was literally there, and then he wasn't there, and then he was there again, you know.
right.
And it was he didn't know how to use the mic.
And
Most singers did. I mean, you know, if you had Janis Joplin, for example, she'd be right up on one of the mics and they'd be ignoring the other one.
I watched down at the Hollywood Bowl, Andy Stein of Commander Cody and his Lost Planet Airmen couldn't get the bell of his saxophone around just one of the elements.
Poor guy.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would do it. You know, and but they did cancel the far field pretty well, you know. I mean, they could have this whole sound thing behind without squealing, you know, and it would not do anything.
Can you talk a bit about, what was it like interfacing with the Dead sort of bruiser road crew right in this era as the Wall of Sound was starting to scale? The Dead was touring a lot in 72 and 73. And of course they sort of there was a sort of a precipitous drop in 74. They only played around 40 shows with the full Wall of Sound. But as as a tech and as a consultant, what was it like, working with some of these guys who, they knew the gear, they knew the sound to a degree, but they were muscle, they were setting this thing up and tearing it down every day. What was it like just trying to mesh and work with them?
Mostly it was okay.
Yeah.
They either left me alone or because we didn't have anything in common that much. I mean, I would help. I mean, one of my situations from the very beginning was after the gig, the band would go away, but we would be there. I would help to put things away. And I wouldn't necessarily do a lot of the heavy lifting, but I would do, we had cables and we had equipment and we had amplifiers to box. We had all kinds of things we had to do. And and it was just more hands helps, it gets it done because it's just a necessary evil. You're already been there the whole evening and you really want to go home, but you can't go home because you gotta unload, you gotta load the equipment up and get rid of, take it out of the place,
Right.
So that's but I got along with some of them. I got along with pretty well. Sparky they gave me a loudspeaker. Maybe I can find it for you. Let's see if I have one. I think I do have. This is a miniature version of the Grateful Dead sound system.
Oh, nice.
See the little tie-dye? That's the original tie-dye.
Yeah, the Courtney Pollock tie-dye.
And this is this very nasty, 14 ply birch.
Yeah.
And it's like wood. I mean, it's steel.
Yeah.
I'm hitting it with my fingernails, I go wham.
Yeah.
And these were made for the roadies and the band for when you were in their hotel rooms. You had a pair of these, coupled with a tape recorder, and you could play back the recordings from the evening or whatever.
The oratones people use for monitoring in studios. Somebody wanted to know if anybody inspected the wall before and after each show for damage.
I don't think so. One of the things that would happen is that the pressure was the wavefront was so powerful sometimes that if we weren't careful, it would try to push the top speakers back and they could fall over backwards.
Whoa.
So we had to C-clamp them. We had to actually use clamps to hold the speakers together sometimes. The top ones,
Oh.
Bottom ones, they were already under pressure.
Yeah.
The top. Yeah, you get this wham, it's almost like a
Knew that Newton's
rocket.
law would affect speakers in space.
Right. Um, I mean, John mentioned it too, the Frisbees. The ever-present threat of Frisbees. This is sort of something that I just came across looking at old news clips, old interviews with the band. Yeah, the paper domes on the front of those JBL speakers. You know,
All of them are domes except the tweeters,
right, yeah. But
the little cones, or the 12s or the 15s.
right. And like,
All paper.
and Frisbees would come flying out of the crowd and would clip those domes. And I think in 73, I think there's a quote from Lesh that they lost around 200 some odd speakers to like frisbee strikes.
Oh,
So I don't know if that was something that they were inspecting necessarily, like after every show, but that
yeah. Well, you wouldn't necessarily. You'd see it. I mean, after all,
Sure.
the speakers looked a lot like the one that you have behind you. You
Yeah,
didn't
right.
have for some reason they decided not to use the tie-dye, which they had used in the years before.
Right. Yeah,
Yeah.
actually,
So they didn't have protection. That's a protection screen, you might say,
right.
which they didn't use. And the deal is that things, you'd see the damage.
Right.
And
Yeah.
but not always. I mean, sometimes you just have to listen. I mean, they'd have to run like a tone through the system. Let's say somebody said, "Man, my monitor or whatever I have, like that one that you have,
Yeah.
it doesn't sound right." Well, they would go in and they put a test tone, through it, and maybe listen to each driver, and one of them would sound buzzy or something, and then they knew that they had a problem, which wasn't obvious, but was necessary to replace but thank goodness we could replace them.
Right.
Because we didn't have to just start from scratch or anything when something got broken.
Right. Yeah.
More than once I saw roadies up there changing speakers during the show. I guess
Oh, really?
somebody sees a Frisbee hit and says, "Get up there, A13 needs a new cone."
Yeah.
Well, that's
Yeah.
crazy, but
I mean,
that's possible. It's
Yeah, no.
possible, because they used to have those quick, you can see the ones in yours. They're
Yeah,
quick
yeah,
disconnect
exactly.
clips. See
Yeah.
the 4 clips on the bottom one?
Right.
Those just unscrew basically, and with the tool, and then you just pull the darn thing out.
Right.
Not like
Yeah.
glued in or something.
Right.
And they had to do that. They actually made those things special because they
Yeah.
had to make it so that they could replace the comb without too much trouble.
Yeah, it's like a quick release function.
And
These
it's not the cone that they're releasing; they're releasing the whole speaker.
Right.
They can repair the cone later.
Right.
But those big guys, usually you didn't. They were hard to replace the cone in situ.
Right.
But
yeah, no, I spoke with plenty of roadies who talked about, during the show, the band is playing and one of them would scurry up the front. Someone would from behind, hand them what they need, pop it out, replace it, and
well, they were like monkeys. It was fascinating. In fact, during one of the shows, or a couple of them, I used to help, and I thought I was pretty tough. I mean, I was young. I was in, weightlifting, and I thought, but they wouldn't let me get up there real high. They were afraid of me because they were afraid I would screw up, and if I screwed up, I'd either kill myself or them or whatever. And they were used to this. They were used to it, and they were in great shape for this.
So something interesting happened in early 1974-ish. So you split off from the Dead scene again, sort of right as the Wall of Sound proper was going to be making its sort of grand.
Yeah, I just, the last thing I read when I was looking through the book was that situation, which was sort of John's last day with the Dead.
Yeah.
And it was, it was funny. Life is a pecking order of sorts in that
Right.
world. If you're the playing in the band, you got top status,
Right.
and the girls know it, and everybody else knows it, and you may not, you might get lucky at a show, but a lot of time, the band members got first choice, whatever that was. And I had thought, because of, well, the way Dan had um, spoken to me, that I was remembered and every time I'd gone back to the concert. In other words, I hadn't been working for them at that time for about 6 or 8 months.
Right. And you were just
I took off. We got this gig in Switzerland.
right.
We we were getting paid many times more, and we had much more power, lab power and everything, doing what we were doing. And we but we were still part of, if I was part of, if I was in San Francisco and they were at the Cow Palace or something, which had happened once, well, of course I went. And in this case, they were in Paris, and they said, "Hey, come to Paris," and that's what Healy said. And I thought, oh wow, boy, oh sure, they're honoring me, I guess. Maybe they'll give me an award. No, but I didn't expect anything really. But but it wasn't quite like that. I realized I really did not belong. In fact, I probably belonged even less at the time, because I was living in Europe. I was doing the European lifestyle,
Right.
which I preferred at the time. I mean,
Yeah.
that's a jacket and a tie, and you're this and that and the other. I had a girlfriend in in London, who was with the Royal Philharmonic. I mean, I was going uptown here. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I was out of the rock and roll world there, and I was into another place. And when I came visiting them, I didn't hold back. I didn't wear a t-shirt. I wore a jacket and a tie. And I shouldn't have, actually. If I think about it now, I probably should have dressed down so that I didn't insult these guys who kind of felt that was the wrong way to be, really. When I worked for them, of course, I went from a jacket and a tie to t-shirts and long hair and everything. I mean, it was normal for me.
Right. Yeah. I will point out too. So, just for context for folks listening, John and I, we were just talking about late 1974. The Dead do something outrageous even by their own standards. They bring a slightly scaled down version of the Wall of Sound to Europe for a short European run. John was already over in Europe. He met up with them in Paris on the last night of the tour. Dan Healy, who was on the crew, invited him out. But I do think it's telling, John, that, even after you had split from the Dead camp and you'd gone to Switzerland with John Mayer in 74, a reporter from the NME, the British music publication, who was covering the Dead's short European wall run in September of 74, called the Dead's gigantic rig, quote, the Bear, Healy, Raizene, Wickersham, Turner, Curl, Alembic PA system. So you're right in there,
Why did the electronics? See,
Yeah.
that is hidden from you guys. I mean, from everybody. You can't see what I did. I actually, like, the differential microphones have an amplifier that I've designed that really did sound good. In other words, I finally made something that Jed really liked, and that is was made and put inside each microphone, each pair of microphones. It was actually put inside, and then that signal was transmitted down to the to the stage.
I assume you must have done that. Did you also design crossovers for the speaker?
Yes, I did. I designed the
Oh.
crossovers for him too.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, can you tell us a little bit about how those crossovers worked?
Oh, they were just passive crossovers. I actually am embarrassed now that I think about what I did compared to what I could do now. Again, it was the capacitors. The capacitors that I used had problems that I didn't know they had, and I couldn't measure them. When I measured them, the test equipment I had at the time wouldn't cover the range that I needed to really wrong with them.
Yeah, I've got a couple more questions. I know there's been some questions in the chat too.
Well, there's one for you, Brian. How much did the wall cost?
That's a great question. Our sort of our best estimate is that it came in at the time around $350,000, which adjusted for inflation, that comes out to coming close to $2.5 million today.
It's about right. It's yeah, I'm not surprised.
Yeah.
Remember, I made 10,000 a year. Okay,
Right.
as an engineer,
Right.
with experience.
Right. And and the thing of it was that, on top of just the pure costs of the gear itself, was the overhead. All of these people were working on this thing. So, the monthly overhead, just to run this whole machine was coming in around like $100,000. So it was just, you can see how it got to a point where they were just like, we have to stop this for a while. This is just it's the Ouroboros. It's what they talked about, they were just burning money. But yeah, I mean the gear itself, we're looking at roughly 2.5-ish million dollars, in today's dollars. That's sort of our best estimate. But over the long term, like over really like I was sort of driving at this point earlier that, the story of the Wall of Sound sort of begins at the very beginning of the band. So if you look at that first kind of 10-year era, essentially 65 through the end of 74, just think about all the money that they spent on all the gear over the years. I mean, it's hard to even put a price tag on
Well,
it.
they did it, but they didn't pay for it originally. Remember, Bear bought it.
Sure,
He-
Owsley, yes.
LSD and all that, and he must have made a lot of money at it. He had a lot of extra money, and he's the one that would go down and buy these darn things cash, and
yeah.
and bring them in and say, well, here, I got another amplifier for you, kind of thing.
Right. Yeah, he
So for years he supported them where they were very poor, really, comparatively speaking.
For sure. Yeah. You made a really interesting point in the book that, if it weren't for Owsley in those early days, the Dead kind of, would have come up against hurdles that most any other band did at the time, but he was there to sort of, kit them out with top flight gear from the very beginning. And that sort of set them on a leg up from pretty much anyone else.
Phil referred to him once in a conversation with me as a true patron of the arts. He did that thing. He put his personal fortune into supporting other people's creativity, which is the definition of the term.
Well, he was like me, was this frustrated musician or artist himself. I mean, yeah, it's like what we do is we do what we can,
What would you rather have done, John?
Well, I used to be in a rock and roll band. I mean,
Yeah.
I started with at the same time,
Huh.
as the rest of the guys. You bet.
Say
It
more.
just wasn't good enough.
What did you
I
play?
had a Fender Stratocaster,
Oh, nice.
1958. You know, that was a long time ago. And yeah, I was in a band, rock and roll band in high school. And
Did you ever record or anything?
oh no,
I see.
no. And then I shifted over to classical guitar more, or folk guitar more. And you know, but you're still, once you've done that, once you played in the band, you know, you're frustrated. Matthews, for example, who became a recording engineer, he played in a band or sang in a band.
Sure.
I couldn't sing. My biggest problem is that my voice changed when I was, you know, when I got to be a teenager, and I couldn't stay in tune very easily, and so that was my weakness when I was even in the band. I was
Yeah.
a solo guitarist, but it didn't make any difference.
Healy is a musician too.
Who?
Dan Healy. Didn't
Dan
the Roadies have a band?
Yeah, I bet it. Oh, the roadies had Sparky.
Yeah.
Heather,
Sparky.
yeah.
Yeah. Sparky and the Ass Bites from Hell was the roadie.
I remember teasing Dan. I was saying, "Well, Dan, I just got another Strat. You know, maybe I can get in the band now. You know." And he says, "Yeah, lots of luck, Carl. You know." He says, "Sparky and all those guys tried, but it didn't work."
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, it takes a special kind of person. What's interesting, and this is not known, I studied ballet as well for a number of years, a few years, and Osley did too.
Yeah.
Yeah. Owsley.
And he was a really good, apparently he wouldn't talk to me about it, but he, back in the 50s, he was a very advanced. He found, just like me, you either have it or you don't. You know, you either become Nijinsky or you don't. You know what I mean? You try, you go up the scale, and then after a while, it's just like a great athlete.
Right.
You know where your limits are.
Right.
And you know, you can keep going and be second best, and you know, or you can just say, no, I think I'll do something else. Thank you.
Right. John, I've got just a couple more questions for you. I know there's been some questions popping off in the chat, but there's a great quote from you in the book, and you know, I'll give folks just sort of a little teaser here. In one of our conversations, you and I were talking about the Wall of Sound, of course, and you told me that, quote, "I've heard mixed reviews of the sound. Some people liked it, some people didn't." And then you added that the wall has a kind of magical power that can take one over, but it wasn't that big of a success. It was just big. And you said, "We went all out. We tried our best, but we didn't have all of the knowledge that was necessary."
That's
So
true.
I'm wondering, looking back, what do you think is the biggest lesson that you learned from your time working with the Dead on the Wall of Sound?
John Mayer and I, and John was there, you know, when we were creating the Wall of Sound. He didn't work directly for that, but he worked with me, and we were friends and colleagues. And then we went off to Switzerland to make this recording studio. And part of this that was to be able to PA speaker that was really first class. In other words, something that would replace the Wall of Sound, you might say. And we did. We actually worked a year or so and made a 3-amp, you know, tri-amplified, just like kind of like the Grateful Dead system that could get loud and clean and small-ish. In other words, it took about 1/4 or 1/5 the height or the amount of, but it got just as loud. What we did was learned how to improve the existing designs that JBL and others made to get them to not screech at us, you know, I mean, when they got loud. And it was we had to make our own horns, for example. We actually used the horns, and but Meyer was designing those, and he became, Meyer Sound, and he actually started making these speakers he actually replaced the wall of sound. In other words, the thing about it, and the really important thing about the replacing the wall of sound, was he still had to get the SPLs up, and you had to get at least not maybe everything the Grateful Dead, the wall of sound could do, but a lot of it. And we could do it in a manageable way so that it didn't take so many people to, carry the load.
Right.
And so I actually, one of the things that you said in the book, which was not quite completely accurate, although I probably told you that at the time, that I told Jerry, to go, and but because I was disappointed, I thought I was, should have been treated a little bit more, but better, but anyway, a little bit better. But the thing is, I work for the Dead. Healy brought me back in 5 or 6 or 8 years later. I was working with my own company called Vendetta, and I built stuff for the Grateful Dead. I built a line driver in the system, because Meyer couldn't do it. Meyer could build the speakers. He actually could build pretty good systems, but he couldn't build specific things. And I was brought in. Gee, what was that? Late 80s, to do to work with the Dead. And then I got laminate. Finally, I got a laminate for years through Healy, so I could go to I can go backstage and all that, without any trouble.
Sure.
But so I was nominally included, but I never felt close to the that close to the band itself anymore, because they really didn't have that much to do with me. I wasn't doing anything specifically for them, except maybe helping the PA a little bit.
Sure.
So, yeah, but that's the way it was.
Yeah. Has there been anything like the Wall of Sound since?
I don't know.
I might have a comment on that particular question.
Please.
In a funny way, the principles of the Wall of Sound are in use all over the place, down on the ground level. And one of the ways that working musicians like myself get through the world is to use these little tiny, Bose makes these little personal PAs, and other people make them too. It's a similar thing where the speaker is behind you and you don't need a monitor, And there are bands, I sometimes play gigs where each of us brings his own personal PA. I play my guitar and sing through my personal rig, and the guy next to me does that. So it's not because we want to avoid IM, it's because it's the most practical way to play music in small ensembles in weird spaces and stuff. But the idea and the principles are in use, and they've reached all the way down to the consumer level where people can have really, really high quality audio. And in fact, that led to a question I wanted to ask you, John, about what, if anything, that you learned in that era served you in furthering in your career as you went off into consumer audio and all the other stuff you've done.
Well, when I built this amplifier, and I was smarting from the time that we'd made that mixer, and it didn't work out with the Dead. And I didn't know if I could make something that the band would really approve of. And so I was working, even though I was working on the Wall of Sound, I worked on an amplifier module, you might say, that was not completely an op amp, as we call them, op amps, but it was very, very fast. It was very, very linear. It was all symmetrical, and it was my baby. It was something I invented, and when we tried it, the band liked it. Well, that was great. So what we were going to do, that we had to make these things. So we gave these things I gave them to Mark Levinson, who was a young man who had his own company, and he was using ICs. In fact, the very same IC that I had found wanting 5 years or several years before. So we had Mark Levinson build. He was good at this. He was a very skilled builder at the time. We had him build these modules for us. So the dad got, hired Mark, you might say. I hired Mark to build these modules. And then they got, that's what we used in the Wall of Sound. Well, Mark started using the modules for home hi-fi. And that's when we created what was called the JC2. And that was something that those are my initials. And then, there's a 2 because it was a second model, a thing that we were making from me. And it wound up becoming kind of revolutionary because it could compete with tubes. In other words, there was good tube equipment out there, but I could make solid state to meet them or beat them. And that was new, that was not before easily done. I had to do a lot of different things to make that happen. In fact, I have a hard time even today making that happen because I have so many other practical problems that the people, when I design, want to solve, like bulletproofing and, a short circuit proofing and all kinds of other things that can actually cause problems. But anyway, I started out. In fact, in the latest Absolute Sound this month, they mentioned me in and Mark Levinson. They said, well, Mark Levinson and John Curl made the JC2, and that started high-end audio. And that's what, that's what somebody said. And so we were lucky. I was lucky that I finally got the combination that I needed to make quality audio that was solid state. And I didn't have to use tubes as much as, even though I like tubes. I mean, tubes have their own qualities. In fact, they almost are too good. They're what we call a sweetener. Often they can sweeten the sound, take the harsh digital sound away, and make it more sweet or smoother. And that is a good thing. My stuff doesn't do that. If you start with digital raw and it's not perfect, my stuff will tell you it's still not perfect. Whereas a vacuum tube unit could actually say, it's okay, now it's listenable. It's right. Fascinating thing. Anyway.
Yeah.
We would have stayed with vacuum tubes, in fact, with the power amps, if they would have made them. You talk about these, was it 2200s or something? What was the number? There's a unit that the Grateful Dead bought from Macintosh.
Well, they used the 2300s.
2300s, okay. I never. The main thing is what we really liked were the 350s, but we couldn't get them anymore. They stopped making them. So when we went to order them for the Wall of Sound, we couldn't get them. Huh. We had to use the 2300s because that's all there was. And we still had the old, the earlier units that Bear and all, and the Dead had been using. We used them for the tweeters usually, because that's where it's most critical. The most critical part is the tweeter, the high frequencies. So we used the 2300 and everywhere else, and then on top we would use the the vacuum tube unit to keep the sound sweet.
And touching on life after the Wall of Sound, life for you and life for the Dead and life for the sound after the Wall of Sound. And I think a lot about why it ended I think there's, any number of reasons why it all shut down and the band took a hiatus and came back in a much kind of different form. Um, but Garcia, in a post Wall of Sound interview that he gave, he once called the wall a quote, a physical model of the size of the sound that we were trying to recreate. So that would explain, among other things, Phil Lesh's 32 foot tall bass stacks, right?
Well,
30,
it really cooked, you know. I mean,
yeah,
it
yeah.
really did. I don't
32.
know how you could do it any other way, even
Right.
today. Do it.
Yeah, exactly.
You
And,
might get it just as loud, but I don't know if it would be just as accurate
right, right.
or as just as
Um,
effortless.
32 feet being the height of standing bass wave. But so, and Garcia added that, the physical sound model that y'all built, it worked, yet he said, quote, it's the wrong direction for what the world is involved in right now. You can't use that much stuff, he said. You can't use that much power. You can't brute force information out.
Huh.
He said this in 1975 in an interview. So, it seems that, the wall of sound served its purpose for the time, but at a certain point, it was just no longer practical or necessary, really, anymore to continue schlepping 75 tons of gear to city after city after city, venue after venue after venue, every night, in and out. Um,
Oh, I agree.
yeah, yeah, and I feel like the state of the art in sound reinforcement technology got to a point that they could come back after the hiatus with like a very slimmed down system, um, and get the loudness and the clarity that they were getting through the wall of sound, but for a fraction of the price. And they could
A fraction of the weight, mostly.
fraction of the weight, yeah, fraction of the weight. And with a crew that was a quarter the size that it
Oh
was,
yeah.
it ballooned to with the wall of sound. So is that assessment, more or less in line with kind of how you saw things play out as things?
Yeah, I guess. I was kind of taking it, I don't know if once I left the band, I mean, left that situation, I wasn't really doing that anymore. I was working with classical musicians. So I was in symphony orchestra stuff. We go to big halls and all that, and it's completely different. Of course, natural sound from big halls is quite impressive. But of course, I never really got as involved. I mean, I remember saying to the classical students who actually lived with, I'd say, oh, I'd hear rock and roll and say, oh, real music, and they'd laugh at me, because to them it was all, Tchaikovsky and all, or more, much more.
Yeah.
But for me, it's still rock and roll is the thing for me. But that big system, we went up to about 500,000 or 600,000 people, but it wasn't much fun to do that.
Yeah.
And the people weren't happy either. They
Yeah.
they wanted the repeat of Woodstock.
No,
Do that.
that's not a technical problem. That's a cultural problem, right?
Well, it is in a way, but remember, they tried with Watkins Glen. They had all the people. They just only had them for a day, and
Yeah.
the people got really upset. You'd be surprised.
The audio problems were, so that's delay towers came into existence around.
Yeah, that's right. We had that. Well, we had two other companies, and then we had to put a time delay on it.
Yeah.
They were pretty crude, those things, in those days.
Yeah. Yeah. Keysar, a couple months before Watkins Glen, was another early digital delay demonstration. Um, but yeah, I mean, John, you said, like, uh, it wasn't fun anymore. And there's a great moment. There was a band meeting that was called in the summer of 1974, and things were sort of coming to a head. And Danny Rifkin, who was an early co-manager of the band going back to, 66, who sort of pulled away from being a manager, but he kind of came back in kind of like a roadie capacity. Um, he stood up at this band meeting and he said, you know, this just isn't fun anymore. And a lot of people chimed in. That was sort of the consensus, and they just kind of needed someone to say that. And at that point, they decided, like, you know what, let's take a break. But but let's go to Europe first and bring the Wall of Sound there, and then come back and do 5 shows at the Winterland. Uh, but yeah, I think that was, that was the overwhelming sentiment as 1974 was grinding on, that this just wasn't fun anymore. There was also, the gas crisis was on as well. They were just paying exorbitant amounts of money just to truck that thing around, and at a certain point, it didn't make sense on any front.
Right.
Yeah.
Jim asked if you ever worked on the Dead's recording equipment.
I work with, of course, with the their master recorder that they had, the 16-channel Ampex. I mean, but I didn't have to work with it most of the time. I did use it. I mean, I made recordings independently of the Dead, with that equipment. With the last days of the Fillmore, we rented it.
No,
Setup,
Jerry didn't get his Neve until 1977. This was earlier kind of gear, right? Different stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions from the audience out there? Let's see.
I mean, I do see one in there that's interesting. I think maybe Jim asked this as well. Once the Wall of Sound was developed and used, was it tweaked to any degree or left alone for most of its life?
I would have thought you would have known the answer was every damn day it changed.
Well,
Yeah.
when the venues change,
Right.
there were times when it didn't sound very good. I remember one time, I don't remember what auditorium it was, but I couldn't hear a single word.
Well,
Yeah.
Clearly. No one, and nobody could. Can you imagine having a whole show and not being able to understand a single word? And
Yeah.
what could we do? It was the acoustics of the place. We didn't have any fixes for it at the time.
that's fascinating. Somebody asked, Paul wanted to know, what's the weirdest moment of the Wall that you recall?
I think it was when they threw the cocaine down on a speaker, and we all took a good hit, and we were on LSD. I'd been on LSD that evening, and then we all had to put all that equipment in the truck before we got off the stage.
Yeah.
And they pulled that on us. That's one of the things that these guys didn't do. Sometimes the management. Well, Bill Graham was one of the worst. He actually was a guy who would cause problems for people without they shouldn't have been a problem. In other words, he was just not a civil guy. If he didn't want to be civil to you, he wasn't. And if he could go out of his way to give you a hard time, he would. Just like there was one guy Sparky, I saw it in your book, where Sparky intervened from Heard. Heard was giving some poor guy a hard time who was trying to do his job.
Right.
And Sparky intervened, and he was doing it mostly to save Heard's life, I think, but because there were guns available around. But it's sometimes these people would do the dumbest things. I mean, for example, I got hired. I got 2 or 3 guys from the Mark Levinson people. They wanted to go to this thing, so I got them involved in setting up the sound system. They're the ones that dug the ditches and did all the work, that had to be done, the dirty work, you might say, not the roadies. And these young guys, in their 20s, and And we had to have we had to have passports, so we had to have laminates, we had to have something to prove who we were, so that everything didn't get infiltrated by outsiders. People were always trying to sneak into backstage and this and that. And so but they would change these things without telling us. So one day you walk up, you're going on the stage, you're running the show, maybe you can't get in. Then you got to go to somebody you know where to go, and they say, "Oh, I had the laminate, I had the, they wouldn't let me in. Oh, well, we changed those. We didn't tell you." That was stupid. We're running the show sometimes, and the one poor guy of the Levinson group got attacked, even though he had all the right stuff, right up to the last minute. They didn't recognize him, and they threw him out into the audience.
Yeah.
And for no good reason.
Yeah.
There's a bunch of sons of bitches back there occasionally, man. I had a few run-ins here and there myself.
Oh yeah, well, it happened with me with Bill Graham, and it was not with the Dead. It was with they were doing a concert in the Berkeley auditorium here, just down the street from me now, and I was doing testing to see what was wrong with the system before the wall of sound could be built. You see, I was in there with measuring equipment, and I had my measuring equipment on the stage. I went to dinner. And I tried to get back in, and some guy had his foot across the way, and said, "You can't come in." I said, "Listen, I have the password, and I have the sticker." And he says, "No, I don't know you." So Bill Graham happened to be walking by, and I just talked to Bill Graham because he was part of the movie that I had been working on for the last year. So I said to Bill, as he walked by, I said, "Bill, will you tell this guy I'm okay?" He didn't say a word.
Oh my God.
And he just talked to me a half hour or an hour before at length, about the movie.
Are you talking about August 1972 at the Berkeley Community Theater?
Yeah.
But people that you don't know, the Berkeley Community Theater is a high school auditorium.
I know that.
I'm telling the rest of the audience.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Because that was where my second, third, fourth, and fifth Grateful Dead shows were. While that was happening to you, I was out there getting my mind blown. But it's a 3,500 seat high school auditorium that John is talking about. And the stage door that he couldn't get through was literally like 20 feet from the stage. You walk through that door and you walk up onto the stage. It was a tiny little place, classic kind of, proscenium theater.
Right.
On a high school campus. I saw some amazing shows there.
Yeah, well, there were some. Back in the days, the folk days, it was really good.
Yeah.
I saw a lot of great artists there back in the early 60s.
Just to tie it back real quickly to the weirdest moment that John was talking about, cocaine on the speaker top. That is a scene that is in the book, a show in 1973 with a prototype wall of sound, and you can read all about the shenanigans that played out during the loadout at that show. John was there, and he told me about it. All sorts of shenanigans at all these shows.
Well, I don't know. For me, it was just like you expressed. I'm really beat. You want to just go to sleep. You've had all day, you've been drinking, we were drinking alcohol too, and we were in the mixing booth. We were running around, kind of bored while the show's going on, and the different bands are going, and then the LSD business, and then we're kind of dog tired, and then we expect to go home that night and start in the morning, get it going again. And all of a sudden we're not allowed to. And they did bring that, the Coke really worked. I mean, it really got us working, and we got it all done. And it gave me battle fatigue. I've never had battle fatigue before, the equivalent thereof, where you can fall asleep standing on your feet or sitting down in a chair.
Damn.
And that was something for me. That was a special for those guys. Who knows?
Yeah.
Oh, another week.
Yeah. Truly amazing that no one died as a direct result of working on the Wall of Sound.
Well, what you said that Bear broke his arm or something.
Well, he fell off the stage at the Oakland Stadium in summer
Yeah.
of '74.
Yeah, he fell off, I think the first level of scaffolding, broke his arm. That show, the Beach Boys famously opened and actually decided to not use, they played through their own PA that show, and that was a real source of friction with Bear that day, who was like, why are you not playing through my magnificent sound system, right?
How dare you?
How dare you not? Yeah. Um, but yeah, as far as I can tell, Bear's broken arm, that was kind of the only injury, amazingly,
Yeah, it
throughout.
was.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of the guys died of different stuff. A lot of people died of course, musicians at the time, the old 27-year-old syndrome.
Yeah.
And then not with the band so much. Well, Pig died, but there were others outside that Janis Joplin, and what was his name? Anyway, there were a lot of that's a critical year apparently for people to survive drugs. Let's just say.
So many of our generation didn't survive their 20s, and now all of us who survived all that are dying of natural causes. So
Well, it's
kind of
true.
sucks.
Actually, I was very surprised a few years ago when I first saw Kid and Sparky, and I said, "You're still alive? Wow!"
Yeah.
I mean, and they were doing pretty good until now they're not.
Well, I don't know about Kid, but Sparky just passed a couple of months
Right?
ago. Yeah.
Yes, he did.
Yeah, Sparky died early January this year. Yeah, I mean, can read about this in the book too, and I know actually Sparky, I pulled this up, but I asked Sparky about you during one of my conversations with him, and yeah, he called you a genius of electronics. So I know Sparky thought very highly of you, John, and
That's good.
you can read about it in the book.
He could have beaten me up at one point, but that's okay. He did.
Yeah, he's a fellow Chicago boy. He was. But yeah, Sparky played a very I think a very under-recognized, underappreciated role in actualizing the Wall of Sound, and you can read all about that in the book.
Yeah, he did.
Yeah.
He was part.
He's kind of one of the ones that got away when I didn't meet him until just about 10, 15 years ago. And then I started running into him on Facebook and stuff. And I was begging him to come talk on my radio show. His story didn't really get told very often. I'm glad you got an interview with him, Brian. He was kind of one of the ones that got away because everybody I knew who knew him loved him and said it's just that guy. And I would love to hear some of his story. Say again, John?
Sparky was okay. He was scary. In other words, he was big.
He was a big dude.
And he could be, scary, but he was okay.
Yeah.
There was one time when he was actually, I was on LSD again, and it was on my own. And it was, I was not working with the dead at the time. And I went to the New Year's Eve thing, and I got on some LSD, and I decided that I was going to see what I could get away with. I don't know why. I'm not that kind of person usually. I'm usually very careful with, I'm scared to death of authority. All of a sudden, I'm getting backstage, and then I'm getting on stage, and then I'm bringing my girlfriend on stage, and there was a little peanut gallery that everybody was supposed to sit in on the side of the stage, and I wouldn't sit there. I was standing behind the band with my girlfriend, and Matthews was mixing in the, and he said to Sparky, get Curl off the stage. So Sparky comes, and I said, Sparky, I taught you everything you know, and blah, 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 blah. And he says, oh, well, Colonel, just tell your old lady not to step on the cables. And that was nice of him. He could have grabbed me and said, okay, Colonel, you're not working with us now. You know, you don't have a right to be where you are. And even Bill Graham I stared him down that night. I was really, I was ornery. I'm very unlike myself. I mean, you know, my alter ego, you might say, just happened to hit, you know, where it was so funny. I could get away with anything then, you know, if you've ever been that way in an environment where you just, you know, you come on so strong, people are afraid to say no.
John, you know, they say that LSD just takes whoever you are and amplifies it, turns it up to 11. So maybe you're always like that. You just show.
Yeah, I guess. I don't know. But I haven't had any acid in a very, very long time, I must admit. And I don't think I'll ever will again. But I had it even, you know, I mean, the stuff that you got to admit that the stuff that Bear made was awfully clean.
Mhm.
Very important. Very important.
Yes.
Get people from going crazy and stuff.
No, on New Year's Eve, 1990, we were broadcasting around the globe. Dan Healy organized this, and the great Ken Nordine came and joined our broadcasting crew. And we had Barry Scott from KPFA, Healy's pal Jack Ellis was co-hosting, and me and Ken Nordine. And about 10 minutes before we went on the air, Bear came by and handed me a tab of acid. I said, thank you very much. And I saved it for another time.
Yeah, I understand.
And it was great shit too. But I think he expected me to go ahead and take a dose about acid before going on a 6-hour global broadcast.
Well, that's what happened with me on stage at Watkins Glen. He came with me, you know, and it's in the thing. He a handful of these little pieces, actually. He said, this is your dose, you know. I made it just for you, you know. This is like a bartender making a special drink. I was out of, I mean, it really threw me I couldn't really enjoy it after that because I was out of control almost, you know.
Too much acid?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I had to go into, I didn't take it all either. I didn't even I took 2/3 of what he'd given me. Gave me 3 little things and 2 out of 3. And what happened was that I got into a box, it's in the book. I just, like a shipping box, you know, and I just stayed there. It was comfortable enough. Just so I had an enclosed space. I knew where I was, because when I looked out at the group, you know, there was 200 or 500,000 people out there. They all looked like a nest of snakes.
Oh,
yeah.
You know, yeah, man. Woo.
It's all in the book.
It is.
That was a good one.
For those of you who don't know, I, as I mentioned earlier, I read Brian's manuscript and did a little bit of fact checking with him. It's a really excellent and well-researched book, very thorough. He talked to lots of different people, and I didn't find a lot that needed correction. And I endorse the book wholeheartedly if you're interested.
Yeah, I do too.
Thank you
It's
both.
excellent.
Thank you both so much.
I don't know what happens now. I think somebody from the SFAS takes over again. Says
Here, very good. It
Hi,
was
Jim.
Hey guys,
Hi.
it's been sitting in the background. It's been a spectacular event, great history, so unique. And yeah, I think we had a lot of positive comments in the chat room, and it's been a little over 2 hours of amazing history and anecdotes and a lot of technical stuff that I didn't understand at all. But when I talk to John, that's not uncommon, at least for me. So
Me too.
thank you all very much. I think I will stop recording at this point.